Let's see, a couple of things going on. We have a online exam sort of event coming up here in the near future that probably won't happen over the next couple of days. More likely than not, I will post that on Friday or Saturday or something like that, and I'll specify how much time you have to complete it. So it'll be not for very long. I mean, it'll be up for a couple of days or something like that. And then you will have just a limited amount of time to complete it. There are old exams on the web page, and you should look at those. I think there's even an old online exam that you should quiz that you should look at to see how it's going to be structured. So the way it'll work is that there will be a link on the web page. You click that button, and it right away takes you to this form that you then fill out. They are geotagged and timed and all of that sort of stuff. I get your IP address and whatnot, and that's just so that I can make sure that you know that it's in as much as I can do that. Make sure that it's you and that there aren't multiple people doing it all at the same time. Okay. More about that at the end. I've never had any students complain about how those things are structured. I think they're pretty generous, and I think you'll find it to be relatively straightforward and easy to deal with. Okay, let's get started then. Last time what we did was we talked about mating systems, and we made the contrast between polyandry, polygyny, and polygamy, right? And then monogamy, and there was one other mating system that we basically just skimmed over, and that's promiscuity. It turns out that promiscuity is the most common mating system of all. If you were to look at organisms across the globe, the most commonly used mating system is promiscuity. And you say, well, you think to yourself, well, that's certainly not the way I view the world. I mean, that's not what you are in the strictest sense of the term. That's not what cats do and dogs do and so on. But if you think about it, that's what grass does. That's what dandelions do. It's what maple trees do. That's what most, not all, but most plants do, right? So mating, that's what a lot of fish do. So mating is basically, for most organisms, just panmictic. You just dump your gametes out there, and they're on their own from that point forward. So that's just something to keep in mind. All right, what we want to do now is imagine that we've already accomplished part of that goal, and we now want to talk about life history theory or life history strategies. And there are a couple of questions that we need to address, and I'll just introduce the questions and then we'll move on from there. The first one is, when should you reproduce? And by that I mean, should you reproduce early in life or should you reproduce later in life? Those are important questions. Yeah, I understand, should the deer reproduce in the fall or should the deer reproduce in the spring, right? And that's pretty easy to understand. You want to time reproduction with availability of resources. So we're asking the question here on a slightly different level, meaning early in life versus late in life. Next is, how often should you reproduce? Should you reproduce at every possible opportunity, or should you reproduce less often? And you can see, even amongst yourselves, some of you come from families that have pretty limited reproduction, and others from families that have quite extensive reproduction, right? So some of you, in other words, some of you come from very large families and others come from very small families. Okay, so that decision has important consequences. And remember what we're trying to do. We're trying to maximize our inclusive fitness. So as you go through life, you're playing this evolutionary game, right? And the objective of the game is to maximize your inclusive fitness So all of these questions are geared towards answering that question, how do we do that? Next, and this is something that you've probably thought about on your own, and that is, with whom should you reproduce? Not all potential mates are equal. Some of them will have higher fitness consequences than others. So we want to think about those questions. And then also, how much energy should you involve or should you invest in reproduction? And or how much energy should you invest in each offspring? And you've certainly seen the disparity there even amongst humans. If you look around at various people, some people invest very little effort or energy in reproduction, and others invest quite a bit. Some invest very little in each offspring, and some invest considerable amounts in each offspring. And those, that has fitness consequences as well. Don't go thinking that, well, it's obviously better to invest more in your offspring, right? That's not necessarily true. It depends, okay? And that's the interesting part of all of that, is figuring out when you should use which strategy. So remember, the whole objective is to maximize inclusive fitness, and we imagine that organisms should behave in a way that maximizes that inclusive fitness. And that, after all, is what the game of evolution is all about, right? It's like playing any other game, right? There's a certain strategy involved. If you want to win, you're better off following that particular strategy. The same thing applies here. Don't get me wrong. You don't have to play the game. I mean, you are playing the game whether you like it or not, but you don't have to play it in a way, you know, designed to maximize your inclusive fitness. If you want zero inclusive fitness, that's perfectly okay, right? I tell my kids that all the time. Don't worry about it. If you want it, do it. If you don't, don't, right? It's your life. Do what you want, right? Do whatever brings you joy. Do what makes you happy, okay? So the universe is coming to an end. Our solar system is dying. In the grand scheme of things, it makes no difference, okay? Play, don't play, don't worry about it, okay? All right, so the question is, do organisms do that? And there are a couple of other things that we need to think about when we're talking about this, and that is that parental care and fecundity are inversely related. What do I mean by fecundity? When we talk about an organism that is fecund, right, we're talking an organism that reproduces a lot. Okay? So clearly, if you have more offspring, right, your ability to provide parental care to each offspring is going to be somewhat less. The fewer offspring you have, the more parental care you can devote to each offspring. Okay? It's easy to think of examples of that, even within humans. People that have 12 kids, the amount of care and attention that any one kid gets is going to be a lot less than if there's just one kid, right? All right. Now, it turns out that organisms or offspring that receive very little parental investment generally have a lower probability of survival, right? And offspring that get a lot of parental investment generally have a higher probability of survival, right? So there is that important consideration, and you're thinking to yourself, well, then clearly, why don't parents invest as much as they possibly can into each offspring to improve, you know, the success and survival of the offspring, and therefore increase their own inclusive fitness? And the answer is that it's actually a little more interesting than that. Okay. You can, to think about it, you can think of bunnies and elephants, right, to help put it into context. Elephants reproduce infrequently. I don't know if you followed the news about the elephant at the St. Louis Zoo. Raj, who is a male elephant at the St. Louis Zoo, produced another offspring. And the pregnancy in Asian elephants lasts somewhere between 20 and 24 months. So they're pregnant basically for 2 years. And then when this offspring was born, at first everybody was really excited, and it was, I think it was another male, okay, and they were pretty excited about that. But then this elephant didn't do well, right, this baby elephant, and within, I think, about a month or so, the baby elephant died. And they were trying all sorts of little strategies. The problem was that the elephant wouldn't eat very well, and they couldn't figure out what was going on. So that was a rather significant loss, right? So here's this female elephant, she's pregnant for 2 years, and then nothing comes of it. And those 2 years that she's pregnant, she can't reproduce with any other elephants, right? Compare that with bunnies, right? Everybody makes jokes about how bunnies mate and so on. And it is kind of intriguing if you're curious about those sorts of things. We'll save that for a different class. But they reproduce a lot, okay? So a female, right, can produce a litter of offspring, and within that same year, those offspring can reproduce. Or think of feral hogs, right? A feral hog that's 3 months old can already be pregnant. So these are animals that will reproduce multiple times every season, and when they do reproduce, they produce lots and lots and lots of offspring, okay? So it wouldn't be at all unusual for a sow to have 12 piglets, 10 piglets, something like that. So their reproductive potential is really quite high. So there, if the female bunny loses a litter, it's not that big of a deal. If she loses 1 or 2 of the baby bunnies, it's not that big of a deal. There are plenty additional opportunities to do that, right? So here are 2 fundamentally different strategies. The elephant invests an enormous amount of energy into 1 offspring. The bunny invests very little energy into each offspring. Okay, when the baby bunnies are born, they're basically just little pink slabs. Okay, they're just little worms or something. They're totally helpless. Not true for the elephant. The elephant is born, it right away stands up, it's ready to go. Okay, it's going to nurse, but it's basically ready to go. Okay, so those are 2 very different strategies. Just sort of as an aside, what's the average litter size in humans? 1, right? So how do you know what the average litter size in any mammal is? How can you figure that out? Easy. You flip them over on their back and you count the nipples and divide by 2. And that works for every animal except for a couple of marsupials that do weird things. Okay? But basically, the average litter size is half the number of nipples. Well, yeah, duh. Okay? So the little pup or whatever is feeding on 1 nipple. The other one needs to recharge. Okay? So that's just one of those little tidbits of knowledge that I don't think you can go through life without having. Right? So your educational dollars well spent right there. The whole semester was worth just that little tidbit. Okay. So which strategy is better, the elephant strategy or the bunny strategy? And the answer is it depends on availability of resources and amongst many other sorts of things. Right? Basically, what it comes down to, though, is the probability of survival of the offspring. Okay? If the offspring have a high probability of survival, it makes sense to invest a lot in those offspring. If the offspring have a low probability of survival, perhaps you shouldn't invest quite as much in those offspring. Okay? So if offspring survival is questionable, don't invest a lot in it. offspring survival is assured, you should invest a lot. Think about it like a car, okay? You have a car and it's got 350,000 miles on it and you didn't pay much for it and it's a pile of crud and all of that, and suddenly some major component in the engine goes out and you're now faced with the dilemma. You know, do you repair it or do you just call it the salvage yard and have them tow it away? What makes more sense? Compared to you just bought your brand new BMW and it's all tricked out and it's got leather upholstery and you spent, you know, $120,000 buying this car or something. And something happens to it and now you're probably much more likely to pay for the repair, right? So what do you have invested in it? How much should you continue investing in it? There's a point at which you're going to cut your losses and say, enough, right? We're walking away from that. So here, we're thinking about offspring survival. What's the likelihood of offspring survival? Is it high or is it low? If offspring survival is low, then perhaps we should walk away from it. Okay? As an example, let's compare two southwestern rodent species. The first is the pinyon mouse, which is, you guys are, even though you don't know the name, you've probably seen them, not the little mice that are in your barn or in your garage, or hopefully not in your house. The mice that you see in your garage, or your house, or your barn are European house mice, okay, Mus musculus. They're gray on the top and gray on the bottom, you know, and they have a gray belly, and then they have a tail that doesn't have a lot of fur on it, okay? So those came over with Christopher Columbus. They came over with the Pilgrims and all of that sort of stuff, and they live everywhere across the planet. It's probably the most successful mammal species on the planet, even more successful than humans. I'm talking about a mouse that looks very much like the deer mice or the white-footed mice that we have here. So if you're out in a field, you're likely to encounter a deer mouse, which is a beautiful little brown color and has a white belly and has a nice fluffy furry tail. Or the white-footed mouse, which is called the white-footed mouse because it has little white feet, sort of, okay? Also nice and pretty brown, a little bit bigger than the deer mouse, and then, you know, has a nice little white belly and a nice fluffy tail and all of that. So they're really cute mice. The pinyon mouse looks a lot like the white-footed mouse with one major exception, and that is that it has these enormous ears. So the ears are fully an inch. So it looks like Dumbo the elephant, okay, only in the mouse version. It has these gigantic ears, and it's just cute as hell. And these guys live in the pinyon woodlands, okay, so they're specialists on pinyon pine. Okay, they eat the nuts from the pinyon pine cones. Which, just as an aside, this will not be on the test, but are you guys familiar with hantavirus? You know what hantavirus is? If you spend time on a farm, okay, or if you spend time out in the field trapping or hunting or whatever, you need to be aware of hantavirus because hantavirus is here in Missouri, okay? Where does hantavirus come from? Hantavirus is very much like hemorrhagic fever, which is a viral disease that people in Korea and Vietnam were picking up, okay, during the Vietnam War and the Korean War. And so it's a rodent-borne disease. The fun thing about hantavirus is that its primary host comes from Peromyscus. Okay? And the way we discovered it in this country was sort of interesting. People from California started moving to New Mexico, right? Because property values were cheaper and New Mexico is a glorious place. But what they did, because they sold their houses in California, they had all this money, they moved to Santa Fe, New Mexico, okay? Which just sort of an artsy-fartsy kind of a place, and it's a little more expensive to live there. It's absolutely drop-dead gorgeous place to be, okay? And they get there, and people are burning pinyon in their wood-burning stoves and things of that sort. And you go around to these little shops, and you can buy pinyon nuts, and you can roast pinyon nuts, and they're actually really tasty. So all these ex-Californians are going around, they go, God, let's go for a hike. And they go for a hike, and they find pinyon nuts. So that, oh man, we don't have to buy these things, we can collect them on ourselves. And they do that. Well, the Navajos and the Hopis have been harvesting pinyon nuts throughout their history. Okay? So this is what the Indians have always done, is they've collected pinyon nuts, and then they eat the pinyon nuts. It's part of their diet. So here are all these Anglos now that are going to go out and do the same thing. They want to be one with nature, you know, peace, love, dove, flowers, incense, beads, waterbeds, crash pads, that whole thing. They're going to have some pinyon nuts. But when the Indians do it, they go out and they find the pinyon pine tree, and they wait for the cones to drop, and then they're harvesting the nuts in that way. Okay? Pinyon mice harvest pinyon nuts too. And what the pinyon mice do is they get all these nuts together and they put them into little piles. They larder hoard them. They put them in these little piles, and then to say, this is mine, damn it, leave it alone, they poop on it and they pee on it. Okay? So they make these little piles of nuts and they poop and they pee on the nuts so that all the other mice will leave it alone. And the other mice do. So now these Anglos are walking around, communing with nature, peace, love, dove, all that stuff. Oh look, how convenient, a little pile of pinyon nuts. And they'll pick down and scoop it up. And they'll eat a couple on the way back to the car or something like that. That of course the mouse has pooped and peed on. And the virus is transmitted through the poop and the pee of the Peromyscus. So they're infecting themselves with hantavirus. And when hantavirus first emerged, it was essentially a fatal disease. So all these ex-Californians were dropping like flies in Santa Fe. It was actually pretty glorious. Okay, kind of cool. All right, those are pinyon mice. All right, so they don't live long. The average pinyon mouse lives about 6 months. That's it. So it's a short life. In other words, you're born, and within 6 months you're dead. That means everything you need to get done in this life needs to happen right now. And they do. They're born, they're weaned, they're on their own, they become adults, and they start reproducing just like that. And then when they produce litters, it's usually 5 to 6 pups, right? And as soon as those guys are weaned, they'll try it again. So these guys will reproduce year-round. I've caught them reproductive in the middle of January with snow on the ground, and they're reproducing. Okay? Compare that with kangaroo rats, the Panamint kangaroo rat, which is a much bigger animal. The pinyon mouse weighs about 24 grams. The Panamint kangaroo rat weighs closer to 80 to 90 grams, 70 grams, somewhere in there. These guys, on the other hand, live to an age of about 8 years. So whereas the pinyon mouse lives for 6 months, the kangaroo rat lives for about 8 years. And when it produces a litter, it's only producing 2 offspring. Okay? And it's only going to do that once a year on average. Okay? And there are some years where it's not going to reproduce at all. So these are 2 fundamentally different strategies. Now, why do they do that? Why does the pinyon mouse only live 6 months? And the answer is because everybody eats pinyon mice. Owls eat them, snakes eat them, foxes eat them, coyotes eat them, the Indians eat them. Okay? Everybody eats pinyon mice. How's about kangaroo rats? What kangaroo rats do, we've talked about them a little bit already, they have these giant auditory bullae, so they have really acute hearing. They can hear a snake fart at 1,000 yards. Okay? And because they hop, they can escape predation really effectively. The snake begins to strike, and the kangaroo rat is fast enough to avoid the snake bite. They can hear owls flying. You can't. In other words, they have all these strategies to avoid predation, and for that reason, they live a lot longer. All right? So, here's the difference. The little pinyon mouse, if it's going to do anything reproductively, it needs to do it now. The kangaroo rat, I don't know, man, it was a bad year, not enough food out there, whatever, you know, I'm not feeling quite right. We'll wait with reproduction until next year. So they're producing fewer offspring, and each offspring they produce, they invest a lot more energy in it, okay? Little pinyon mouse, pops one out, weans it for a couple of weeks, you're out of here, man, move on, do it again, okay? Two fundamentally different strategies. Okay. All right, let's think about this kangaroo rat pinyon mice dichotomy just a little bit more. Let's think about that dichotomy in terms of humans. Okay? Let's compare the couple that lives in Beverly Hills, all right, with the single mom that lives in Compton or Watts. How are their lives different? All right, if you're living in Beverly Hills, what is your life like? You have no way of knowing. You're not one of those people, okay? I'm not saying you're from Compton either, but you're certainly not Beverly Hills sorts of people. I used to work as a custodian at a rich bitch junior high school, okay? And these kids, they'd get dropped off for school. The butler would drop them off in the Rolls Royce or the Bentley, okay, or the Jaguar or something. And these kids, and this is Southern California, right on the beach, these kids are walking in wearing mink stoles, you know, and all this sort of stuff. These kids have more money in the jewelry they're wearing than I've seen in a decade. I mean, these are just rich kids. Snotty little brats, right? But these are the rich kids. All this effort is invested in these kids. These kids are going to go to high school, and then they're going to go to Harvard or Yale or something like that. For their 18th birthday, daddy's going to buy them a brand new Corvette or a Porsche or something like that, right? Their mom and dad are going to buy them somebody to take the ACT test for them so they can get into USC or Harvard or Yale or something like that, right? And they're going to major in YouTube or TikTok, you know, social, whatever they call that, icon or whatever the hell those things are. They're going to be totally vapid, but they will live a life of security and ease, okay? Compared with the single mom living in Compton. Okay, anybody familiar with Compton, California? Compton, California is one of those places where when you drive through Compton, ignore the street lights. Don't effing stop. Okay? It's red, kind of look both ways, try and, you know, maneuver around the oncoming traffic, but for God's sakes, do not stop. Just keep moving, keep the windows up, keep your head down. Right? Don't make eye contact with anybody, just go. It's a rough, darn place to be, okay? People are getting shot left and right every day. There are little 12-year-old kids on the street corner selling crack and stuff. It's a rough place. You know, every business has steel bars on it so that so the looters can't break the windows out and, you know, loot the place and stuff. It's a rough, rough, rough area. Incredible poverty. So you look at the mother that lives in there, and what does she do? She's going to be on welfare, she's going to be on WIC, and she'll have like 14 kids. No husband, right? A series of guys coming through her life. Probably every kid she has is fathered by a different, you know, by a different guy. And you ask yourself, well, God Almighty, why doesn't she just have one kid and do this right? Why doesn't she do that? Back when Ronald Reagan was president, one of the ways he got elected president was he complained about welfare queens. So he complained about these people that just had more and more and more babies so that they could get more welfare money. Because with every additional kid, you get more money from welfare. And people bought it. Yeah, those damn welfare queens. And all of you, I'm sure, have been to Save-A-Lot and stood in line behind some person paying with food stamps or whatever, and you look at how they're dressed and whatnot, and they go out and get into their used Cadillac to drive away, and you go, good Lord, you know, I don't even drive a Cadillac. And you're outraged and offended. Why is she driving a Cadillac? Why doesn't she drive, you know, a normal car like the rest of us? Well, she's a welfare queen. She's probably got 20 kids at home, gets more money with each one. Think about that. The extra money you get on welfare for each kid, is that enough to pay the cost of that kid? No. With each additional kid you have, you're going further and further and further into poverty. So why is she buying a Cadillac? Because if you're black, you can't get a loan for a house. Nobody's going to loan you money for a house. Cadillacs are cheap. Used Cadillacs are dirt cheap, man. If you can't buy a house, what are you supposed to do? You have a little expendable cash, man. You want something nice. And here's this car. It's a nice car. It's dirt cheap because nobody else wants a used Cadillac. They all buy new ones. So the next time you see that welfare queen, right, first of all, realize that it's bull. Okay? Number two, realize that they're not like you. They can't just go up to the banker and say, hey, I want to buy this house over here. Yeah, let's fill out this paperwork, get you the loan and all that. That's not going to happen. Okay? Black people live in banking deserts. It's different than being a white person. Okay? You need to be aware of that. It's a little bit like the kangaroo rats and the pinyon mice. Okay? Here's this woman living in Compton. She has all these kids. Why does she have so many kids? The reason she has so many kids is because she has 14 kids. How many of those kids are going to reach adulthood? 1 or 2. Okay? There might be 3, but the third one is in prison. Okay? So why? They're getting shot in gang shootings, they're dying of disease, they're getting abducted, all sorts of bad things happen to them, okay? Their probability of survival to adulthood is low. And if they make it to adulthood, and if they're male, they're more likely than not to end up in prison, okay? By virtue of the fact that they're poor. Prisons are filled, regular prisons are filled with poor people. They're not filled with rich people. The rich people, like the Michael Cohens and all those guys, they go to a gentleman's club for offenders, and they're out after a couple of years because of COVID. Okay? It's not, the justice system isn't equally applied. Okay? It isn't. Because that's the justice system the majority of people want. All right. So what are her options? She has these kids. The probability that any one of them is going to make it to adulthood is incredibly low. So what's your evolutionary response? You should make more. Okay? And if the probability of survival of the kid is low, what should you do? Not invest a whole lot in it. It probably won't make it. Better off saving that energy for yet another offspring, so that at the end of the game, you'll have had at least a few that have made it. Compared with Beverly Hills, where you just produce 1 or 2 kids, Each of them has a high probability of success. They're born into wealth, right? They're going to have an easy life, and, right, they're never going to have to be very smart. They're never going to have to work very hard, right? Everything is handed to them on a silver platter. They have a high probability of success. They're going to make it. Okay? Those are the two fundamentally different strategies. So the next time you're out there and seeing what you perceive to be a welfare queen, think about what her life is like compared to your own. I suspect most of you are somewhere in the middle, right? You're not that extreme or that extreme. If you are one of those Beverly Hills people, come on, stop by my office. Let's chat a little bit. I have some ideas for you, okay? Okay? It's different. All right, next. With whom should you reproduce? Well, birds, we've talked about that a little bit already. You've probably noticed that the males are brightly colored and the females are drab. Okay? Why are the males brightly colored?
Because the females pick them.
Yeah, because that's what the females want. So what does the bright color indicate to the female? Well, it indicates, first of all, that the male knows where all the good food is, because it takes a high-quality diet to get those bright colors, right? Number two, right, because you're so brightly colored, every predator out there can see you from forever away, and the fact that you're still alive means you're aware enough and smart enough and fast enough to avoid predation, right? So those are good qualities. How do lizards select their mates? Iguana lizards do it on the basis of push-ups. The male that can do the tallest push-up is the one that gets the female. If you've ever watched iguanas, right, they do push-ups for the babes. The males are doing the push-ups. Two iguana males, and there's the female, they're both doing push-ups. And because the female doesn't have binocular vision, right? She doesn't have overlapping fields of view. She can't really evaluate the size of these guys. So she's doing it straight off the height of the push-up. So what the males do, if one guy, oh man, he's kind of good, he's doing kind of tall, the other male will cheat. And he'll do his push-up off of a rock or off of a log to make it look like he's doing the taller push-up. So they cheat to get the female. How do other animals do it? How do bighorn sheep do it? How do musk oxen? Have you ever seen film footage of musk oxen competing for access to the females? It's awesome. You get these two musk ox males, and they'll be on opposite sides of a field. And they'll look at each other, and they'll snort, and they'll scrape at the ground, and then they'll charge at each other. And they'll slam their heads together. And the horns on musk oxen come right off the top here, and they're really big and bulky, and then they flare out to the sides. So when they butt, those horns are banging together. The impact is enormous. You can watch them. Their whole bodies shake when they hit together, and the ground shakes too. These are big animals, and it's an enormous amount of force. And then they'll back up, and they'll snort, and they'll charge, and do it again, and again, and again, and again, until finally one of them gives up. The one that gives up will run away, and the one that's left behind turns around and gets all the babes. Okay? How do, that's another cool, how do giraffes do it?
They slap their necks together.
Yeah, they're banging their necks together, okay? And so the males will slam their necks together like that, and obviously the one with the longest neck has the most force, and he's the one that wins. And that's why giraffes have long necks. It's not so that they can feed on the leaves up at the top, because they don't. They feed on the leaves that are around the middle. They bring their necks down to feed, okay? but they're slamming their necks together. And because neck length is not sex linked, the females are selecting for males with longer necks, and they too get long necks. Right? Lizards. Oh, well, we talked about iguanas. Anolis lizards have the little dewlap, right, that they flare out. And they flare it out, it's sort of like this dance routine. It's brightly colored. And they have to do the dance moves just perfectly right to get the motor running on the little female lizard. How's about fish? How do fish select mates? What would a fish use to select a mate? Display, right? Think about Siamese fighting fish. The males go through this elaborate display. Sometimes in things like sticklebacks and whatnot, they have these various color patterns, right? These bright colors. But those sorts of things only make sense if you're in a place where there's light. Most fish live in an area where there's absolutely no light. Right? If you go down deep, there is no light. So what would they use?
Like bioluminescence or something.
Yeah, but if there's no light, can you see it deep down? I don't know. I mean, maybe a little bit, but it certainly, you're not going to see it from very far away. It's a good question. Okay? For the most part, we don't understand how most species of fish select their mates, but we know that it happens. Deer. Why do deer? How do deer do it? Think about this. I mean, what do deer do with their antlers?
Defend, or like they smash together.
Yeah, they knock their heads together, right? They're using their antlers in combat. So when I was a student in biology way back in the day, they always taught us animals never fight to the death, which is nonsense, because if you go out in nature, you'll find all sorts of dead male deer with their antlers tangled up, and they got tangled up and they couldn't free themselves, and they starved together, okay? And there their skulls and their corpses are laying totally intertwined. So who wins those contests in general?
The heavier one.
The heavier guy, he's going to have the bigger rack, okay? So why do deer drop their antlers at the end of the season?
Is it because of the testosterone levels?
Yeah, I'm asking a different question. I'm asking the ultimate rather than the proximate question. Okay, so you're answering the technique, right? The pathway, the chemical pathway that leads on. That's not the question I'm asking. I'm asking, why do they drop them?
Try to get big ones next year.
Think about the investment in energy that goes into those antlers. It's enormous. Where the heck do deer get calcium? Pardon?
I said it's not from ash, is it?
Where are they going to find? What, they're going to go around campfires and, hey,
That's
you
what
know,
I'm saying.
some
I'm saying,
Kingsford barbecue stuff here. Let's chew on some of that. That'd be great. Where are they going to get their calcium? They're herbivores. How much calcium is in plant material? Not a lot. There's a little bit in acorns, okay, but not a lot. In other words, they have a hard time getting calcium, and here they're growing these enormous racks. And then, at the end of the season, they're going, hey babes, check this out. They slough them off. I'm going to do it again next year. You stick around, watch me. And then they do it again. It's almost like they're taunting the females, going, hey, you thought that was cool. Watch this. Okay? Bighorn sheep. You know, have you ever seen a Rocky Mountain bighorn sheep? Do you know how heavy that skull is? That skull is 50 pounds. Okay? These horns are curling right, and it's the bighorn sheep with the biggest set of horns that's going to get the female. So what have we done in terms of hunting, trophy hunting? Guys want the biggest bighorn sheep rack they can get. So hunters, and because you can't just take any old, you can take one animal, right? People go out there and they want the biggest trophy ram they can get. So we've exerted significant selection pressure on bighorn sheep, removing the trophy males. And what's happened evolutionarily to bighorn sheep is their racks are getting smaller and smaller and smaller. The problem is that the females are selecting the males on the basis of the rack. So reproductive output on bighorn sheep is going down. Doesn't really make that much difference. They're going extinct anyway. They're gone, just like polar bears. They're going away. Okay. Or elephants, right? African elephants. Female African elephants select their mates on the basis of tusk length. So you say, because poachers are killing all these elephants for their tusks, here's what we'll do. We'll go out there and we'll tranquilize these male elephants and we'll saw off their tusks so that the poachers won't kill them. And the males will still be alive, and they'll still be fine, and they are, except that even if there's no other male around, if that male has really short tusks, the females won't mate with him. Which means you've just eliminated that possible genetic contribution to the population. All right. So in each case, what's happening is that females are evaluating male quality. Okay. So we've already talked about that. Let's think graphically about what that means. And we've had this discussion a little bit already. Let's look at parental investment or number of offspring produced. It's essentially the same thing. So we're looking here, this is the line of isometry, right? So number of offspring produced, the isometric. So as offspring production increases, parental investment goes up like that, okay? Notice what happens to the female parental investment. As the number of offspring she produces increases, her cost goes up exponentially, okay? Having one kid is different from having two, from having three, from having four, okay? The parental investment goes sky high with each new offspring that you produce. What's the optimal number of offspring the female should produce? It's the difference between this line of isometry and that curve. Okay? Where is that difference going to be greatest? It's right there. So we're looking at the distance, the Euclidean distance between there and there. And it's going to be greatest there. So that's the optimal number of offspring for a female. How's about parental investment on the part of the male? It doesn't increase nearly as fast as it does for the female. The male isn't going to be pregnant. The male isn't going to nurse. Yeah, okay, babe, I'll run to the store for you, right? The male's contribution is significantly less. So here's the curve for the male. I mean, it does increase with additional kids. He's got to spend more time driving them to soccer practice or whatever the heck, you know. But notice, here's the optimal number of offspring for the male. Notice how much greater it is than the female. So the optimal number of offspring for the male parent, regardless of which animal we're talking about, is always greater than the optimal number for the female parent. In other words, males are being inhibited by the females. You see that? Here's what's best for the male. There's what's best for the female. You see the problem? So there you are in this committed, loving relationship with a female, and you've reached her optimal number of offspring. You could still do better. You could do more. So what should you do? What do males do? Not all males. What do males do?
They go and find another partner.
They cheat. Right? I mean, they're slimy dogs, right? But you understand now that they're not totally at play, right? Natural selection favors males that cheat. Because the male that cheats and gets extra pair copulations evolutionarily does better than the male that is true blue. Having said that, it's in the best interest of the female that the male stick around. Have I told you guys about my wife, her ability to observe and spot things?
Yes.
I did tell you that story?
Blonde hair.
Yeah, the long blonde hair, yeah. Women are really, really, really good at spotting cheaters. You guys, if you think you're going to get away with it, sorry. If she cares, she'll catch you out. Okay? If she's not noticing, if she's not calling you out, then you need to be worried because who knows where she's going while you're at work. I'm just saying. All right, now let's think a little bit about this. We now know with whom you should reproduce. When should you reproduce? Should you reproduce early in life or should you reproduce late in life? Does it make a difference? Does reproducing early in life influence reproduction later in life? And it absolutely does. Let's imagine that any one of you became a parent while you were still in high school. What's the likelihood that you would be here in this classroom today? Not nearly as high. Okay? If you're a female, you would be at home taking care of the kid, filling out your application for WIC and for welfare and all of that sort of stuff. If you're a guy, you're going to be some minimum wage job, you know, working at Auto Tire and Parts in the warehouse or something like that, or you know, something along those lines. It's unlikely that you'll be in school, which means that your economic future is going to be rather limited, which means then that your ability to reproduce successfully and the success of your offspring is going to be limited as well, right? It's going to be a hard road to hoe. Okay? So, is it better to reproduce early or late? Well, again, it depends. If your probability of survival is limited, you should reproduce early. On the other hand, if your probability of survival is high, you can afford to wait. How do you know whether your probability of survival is low or high? It depends on how predictable the environment is. If you live in a predictable, secure world, in an environment, you can afford to delay reproduction because you're pretty sure that things are going to be good. And you can do better by waiting to reproduce. If, on the other hand, you live in an unpredictable environment, you're not sure what's going to happen next, perhaps you're better off reproducing early. Okay? All right. One example are these African birds called green wood hoopoes. And green wood hoopoes are cavity nesting birds. So there will be a male and a female, they'll find a snag, and there'll be a cavity, an opening in that snag, and that's where they build their nest. And inside that nest, they're going to lay their eggs and all of that sort of stuff. And once the eggs have hatched, they're going to feed the little baby birds and so on. And then the little fledglings have to make a choice. They can go off on their own, or they can stick around inside the nest. More often than not, they stick around inside the nest. And now, because they can't mate with their own brother or sister, what they'll do is they'll help their parents on their parents' next mating. So they'll go out and find food for their parents and all of that sort of stuff. And when their parents fledge the next clutch, they'll go out and they'll feed the new babies as well. So they're brothers and sisters from the next clutch of eggs. Why don't they go off and get their own nest? Because there aren't enough cavities for them. So they're limited by this resource, and they're trying to maximize their inclusive fitness. They can do better by helping their parents produce more offspring than trying to do it on their own, because there are no nests, no nest cavities out there. And that's not the only. Another example of that would be red cockaded woodpeckers in the southeastern US. So red cockaded woodpeckers are cavity nesting birds as well, and they have a limited supply of nesting cavities, and the cavities that are out there are also being used by squirrels. All right, so there's another component of all of this, and that has to do with sexual competition. So imagine, why is it that human females mature sexually earlier than human males? Think back to junior high school. When you were in junior high school, here were all these girls running around and they're developing breasts and all that sort of stuff. And the guys still have these squeaky little high voices, and they're these skinny little guys and whatnot, and they're just dweebs and whatnot. They're just behind. And the females are maturing at such a rapid rate, and the males are not. The males don't have any pubic hair yet. The males don't even have any peach fuzz yet. The males are they're just little kids, and the girls are starting to mature. Why is that? You don't remember that far back to junior high school? You don't remember as a little junior high school boy looking at all these girls and being amazed by what was happening to them and being totally uncomprehending of what was going on? Why do females mature faster than males? Well, what do males have to do in order to get the female? There you are, you're in high school, okay? Some freshman girl in high school, who is she dating? A freshman boy? Who's she dating?
Probably an older guy.
Yeah, a junior or a senior, something like that, okay? What's wrong with the freshman boys? Or the sophomore boys? What's wrong with those boys? Because they're still boys, right? What's the difference between a high school freshman boy and a senior boy? And what else? Facial hair, pubic hair, muscle mass. When does testosterone start to kick in for the male?
16.
Yeah, probably a little bit earlier than 16. Probably, 15 it's starting to kick in, 14, 15, but the effects really aren't obvious until, you're a junior or a senior in high school or something, and then it really kicks in when you're in college or something like that, right?
The young male simply doesn't have the muscle mass, okay? Testosterone, yeah, it's about hair distribution and all of that, but it's also about muscle mass, okay? If you don't have the testosterone, you're not going to put on the muscle mass. I don't care how hard you work out or anything of that sort. No testosterone, no muscle mass. Same thing applies to women. No testosterone, no muscle mass. Fortunately for women, you do have some testosterone, okay? But without the testosterone, you're not going to get the muscle mass. Why do you need the muscle mass? Maybe your high school was different than mine, okay? Maybe you had one of these perfect little, well-behaved sorts of high schools. My high school, it was brutal. I mean, people are getting knocked out every day. You know, there are kids going home with broken noses and broken jaws and stuff. I mean, it was just everywhere you look, there's another fight going on. And it's always about some girl, okay? There's male-male competition for females, right? So here you have some high school senior who's dating the cheerleader and a high school freshman who wants to date the cheerleader. How do you think the senior is going to respond? Not well. Okay, it's gonna like that. You know, let's just get this guy out of here, right? I mean, it's a physical contest for access to the females, just like it is in deer, just like it is in muskox, and just like it is in bighorn sheep. It's male-male competition for access to the females. The same thing happens in us. The same thing happens in chimpanzees. The same thing happens in baboons and orangutans and gorillas. Okay? It's what animals do. For access to females, there's male-male competition. And it's the bigger male in general that wins. All right? So we have these different maturation rates amongst males and females. So why doesn't the 14-year-old boy have all that testosterone yet? Why isn't he bulked up with testosterone at the same rate as the females? Why hasn't he matured at the same rate as the females? Wouldn't that be the fair thing? The male is delaying sexual maturity. So the male is not going to become sexually mature yet for a couple of years, which gives him time, once the testosterone kicks in, to get bigger, so that when he finally does compete for females, he will be at a more appropriate size and has a greater likelihood of successfully competing for females. So the males are delaying sexual maturity in an effort to build mass and to get size so that they can then compete for females. It's that simple. Okay? So that's an example of sexual bimaturism. All right, so now let's think about male aggression. And I want to make the point that it's not simply a consequence of testosterone. I'm sure you guys, those of you that have gone to gyms where there are bodybuilders around, it's fundamentally different than the sort of place that we have here at the rec center. At the rec center, it's all very, calm, cool, collected, milquetoast kind of a place, right? But if you ever had the opportunity to work out in a bodybuilder's gym, it's fundamentally different. I mean, the amount of aggression that's in a bodybuilder's gym is enormous. So these guys, they're all using steroids, and what do steroids do to you? You go into these steroid rages, okay? You just get so outrageously angry, and it's just this mindset which is just unreal, okay? That's a consequence of the testosterone, of the steroid, okay? So, but male aggression isn't simply a consequence of that, right? Male aggression is also this whole plan towards getting access to the females, and the male that's more aggressive is more likely to get the female than the male that is not aggressive. But there is a cost to being aggressive, and the cost is the increased risk of injury. So there's this balancing act. How aggressive should you be? If you're too aggressive, you're going to get hurt or killed, okay? Or break an important body part or something of those sorts. So there's this cost-benefit relationship that goes with that. And you can look at it in this way. So here's the aggressiveness and there's the benefit. And notice as you become more aggressive, right, that aggressiveness increases logistically. So there's an asymptote to how aggressive you can be and what the benefit is, right? So here's the cost right there. There's the benefit. The more aggressive you are, the greater the benefit. And again, just like before, you want to maximize the difference between those two curves. And when you do that, there's the optimal amount of aggression that the male should have. Notice it's not zero, it's non-zero. Okay? So you expect males to have a certain level of aggression. Well, that's what they teach you in business school too, right? That's what Donald Trump has figured out, right, when he approaches any of his competitors or anything. It's all this bluster and it's all this sort of, it's that in-your-face business school, I need this. I mean, I'm sure he doesn't understand the concept of optimality, but somehow, instinctively, he knows that some aggression is going to get you a benefit, okay? Sometimes he goes much too far, and he goes past the point of optimal benefit. All right, so the next question comes, and this is where we'll stop. The next question comes, at what point should the parents terminate investment? Okay? At what point should they say, all right, enough? Your parents probably haven't gotten to that point with you. Your parents probably all give you some level of support. Anybody here not getting any support from their parents? Yeah, welcome to the club, man. My 18th birthday, my dad opens up my bedroom window, picks up all my shit, throws it out the bedroom window, walks up to me and said, son, my legal obligation to you is over. Get the fuck out. Got in my car, left all that shit out there on the front lawn, just drove away.
My dad's homeless.
Yeah, so he wasn't an asshole, he just doesn't have the ability to contribute, yeah, so rather yours than mine, you know.
I had timed that just right.
So, I mean, at some point, right, they're going to cut you off. Should they do it sooner or should they do it later? Well, it depends, right? Because what your parents are trying to do is maximize their inclusive fitness. So if by contributing some additional resources to you, they can get you to the point where you can reproduce, that's good. On the other hand, if continuing to contribute to you reduces their ability to raise additional offspring that are behind you, then perhaps they're more likely to cut you off. Okay? So you can do that cost-benefit analysis and how does that parent-offspring conflict get manifested? Let's ignore that graph and just think about what that parent-offspring conflict is really all about. Think about what your life was like when you were a preteen versus what happened when you became a teenager. What happened? How did your life change once you became a teenager and you're in high school and your body's changing? How does your parents' behavior towards you change? Please don't tell me, oh yeah, it's always been the same. They're just real sweethearts. Well, they just love me so much. And I'm sure they do. I'm sure they do.
My mom got more strict as I got older.
Yeah. And she's getting in your face a little bit more, right? And all. That's that parent-to-offspring conflict. Because what's best for you is not what's best for your parent. What's best for you is that your parent continue to give you this high level of support. right? What's best for your parent is that you start fending for yourself and do this stuff on your own. That's the parent-offspring conflict. What's best for your parent is that they're saving their resources for their other kids, or they're thinking about retirement or something like that, okay? So what's best for them is not the same as what's best for you. What's best, how many of you have multiple siblings? Did all the kids get treated exactly the same? No. Oh, we love you all just the same. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Tell me another one, okay? Love's got nothing to do with it, right? They're playing that evolutionary game, okay? So it's maximizing their inclusive fitness. All right, so let's stop with the lecture material right there. Let's just take a couple of minutes to think about what's going to be on the exam. So get out your note paper and let's jot a few things down for you to review. First of all, we had some basic definitions. Fact, truth, reality, belief, and proof. You need to be able to identify or define those terms. Guaranteed, those terms will be on the exam. Fact, truth, reality, belief, and proof. Okay, next critically important thing is the process of science. Science is a process of conjecture and refutation. So definitions. We have definitions. Okay, there were our terms. Then the process of science. It's conjecture and refutation. Understand why it's conjecture and refutation. Okay, think about our example of a little knowledge bag, right? And if you're always rejecting information, right, or refuting information, you end up with very little knowledge, but it's probably going to be good stuff. Darwin's observations. Darwin's. So what were his 5 observations? There is variation amongst organisms. Some of that variation is heritable. Some forms of variation are better than others. Populations tend to grow exponentially. Populations cannot grow exponentially for very long. And then Darwin's conclusion, right? More offspring are born than can possibly survive. The ones that survive will be the ones with the better forms of variation. So why is Darwin famous? He's famous for natural selection. Okay. Okay, that's the introductory material. Okay, the next thing we talked about biomes. We remember those cells, right? Those air cells. Why is it that the deserts are located 30 degrees north and 30 degrees south? Why is it that the tropics are the tropics at the equator? Why do we have tropics at the equator? Okay, why do we have the boreal rainforests at 60 degrees north and 60 degrees south? Okay, those are the same sorts of things. So think about those air cells, the heating of the air cells, ability to hold water and all of that. Think about, so air cells, AC. Think about east-west slope and north-south slope effects. Okay? Understand why it is that the east side of a mountain is usually more lush than the west side. Think about rain shadows. Think about yearly and daily amplitudes, temperature amplitudes. And the variance, so it's the mean and the variance. Okay, what's the problem with climate change? You guys are familiar with the fires out west? Or anybody totally oblivious to what's happening out there? This fire season has been unbelievable. And Trump went out to California, a state that he doesn't like because it's a blue state. And he had this interview, and one of the NOAA people tried to get the idea across to Trump that one of the reasons the fires were so severe was because of our changing climates. And Trump would have nothing to do with it. And this guy said, well, the best science that we have, points to this, 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 and this. And Trump wouldn't buy it. He says, well, he just said the science is wrong. Okay, I know better, the science is wrong. And he's complaining that nobody's out there managing the forest, which is not true. And he wants people to rake the forest like they apparently do in Finland, which is also bullshit. And this is something that he's brought up before, the importance of raking the forest. I don't think he has a concept. First of all, I don't think he's ever been in a forest. And secondly, I don't think he understands how many acres of forest are there. And last night, I was just sort of thinking about it and trying to figure out how many people you would have to hire to rake all these millions and millions and millions of acres of forest. And it would be like, you would need like at least 1 million people every day out there raking the forest in order. And what would you accomplish? You wouldn't accomplish anything. Why are the forest fires so intense? There are two reasons. One is climate change, but there is another contributing factor. Does anybody know what it is? Smokey the Bear. Because for the last 100+ years, we've been suppressing forest fires. We put them out. We put them out. We put them out. We don't want the trees to burn. We don't want the houses to burn, so we put the fires out. So what you end up with is all this fuel on the bottom of the forest floor. So when a fire does start, which is easier now because of climate change, it burns with intense heat. Historically, forest fires have always happened, but they've been really low energy fires. So and you can look at trees and see it. The fire goes through, burns off all the underbrush, and the trees are just fine. But now the fires are so intense, the trees go up like Roman candles. All right. So biomes. Next thing, we talked about speciation. Remember we talked about reproductive isolating mechanisms. In order to have speciation, there has to be some limit to gene flow. We talked about the kangaroo rats in the Central Valley of California, California Aqueduct and Scenic Route 5, Interstate 5. Okay? Has to be some limit to gene flow. There was behavioral isolation, temporal isolation, morphological isolation. We had a whole list of different isolating mechanisms. Geographic isolation. And then we've done the life history stuff. Okay, so it's not that much material. Guaranteed, you will have to do those. I will ask you what science is. You will have to know Darwin's observations and his conclusions. You will have to know natural selection. You will have to know east-west and north-south slope effects. You will have to know about the biomes in those air cells, okay? You will have to know about temperature amplitudes, daily and seasonal temperature amplitudes, and you will have to know the fact that the variance of those amplitudes is what's important, because that's where the predictability of the weather comes in. And as you hopefully understand, the weather is becoming less and less and less predictable because that variance term right there is getting bigger and bigger. You will have to know about speciation, about isolating mechanisms and all of that, behavioral isolation, morphological, and so on. Know the example of the kangaroo rat. You will have to know about our life history stuff, those questions, when to reproduce, with whom to reproduce, how much to invest in reproduction, okay? Think of the example of the welfare queen and the people in Beverly Hills. Okay, they're just following the appropriate strategies for the predictability of the environment that they're in. Think about that, okay? All right, questions about any of that material? If you have questions, bring it up in lab and we can, talk. We will try and be outside again rather than indoors, so be prepared to be outside. The weather should be absolutely glorious. Yeah.
So the exam will be online and bring this